need to do so that maybe then someday they can actually sail out of sight of land. And the station has been orbiting the Earth as if we're sort of sailing within sight of land as we invent. I mean, what do you make the hull out of? How do you navigate? What food do you need? How do you make a toilet that'll work forever? How do you recycle water? How do you recycle the oxygen? It's the main crucible test bed where we've been trying to grind out all the lessons that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, and even that will eventually let us go to the moon, and even further. That will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon.
Astronauts to the moon.
No, I just find it funny.
We're talking about the origins of the secret space program, and many of you have heard of the Maury Island affair, a very strange, bizarre incident that took place on the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Shortly after Kenneth Arnold, a pilot, gave us the term flying saucer that month, there was a UFO sighting. In this sighting, UFOs evidently crashed, rained debris down upon some civilians, killed a dog, according to the story, wounded a child, according to the story. And between the UFO story, as it was promulgated back in the 1940s, and very serious political and military events of the next 20, 30 years. So, Maury Island affair, there's a UFO sighting shortly after Kenneth Arnold gave us the famous flying saucer story. And a man that we know as Fred Krisman claimed that he had been involved in that incident. He claimed that people had been hurt, that he had pieces of the UFO. And what happened was, individuals of the United States Army Air Force at the time visited Krisman and his partner, Mr. Dahl, and retrieved pieces of this so-called debris of the UFO. They got on a plane, the plane crashed, and both of these Air Force officers died. These are probably the first two victims, mortalities associated with the UFO phenomenon. The first two, there were many more since then, as any student of UFO history knows. So Fred Krisman is this strange guy, a strange background. No one knows too much about him. He seems to have been some kind of confidence man, some kind of criminal, a crook, but maybe also an intelligence agent. Fred Krisman, 1947, seminal event in UFO history. He shows up again 20 years later, being investigated by a district attorney, Jim Garrison, in New Orleans, because of his alleged role in the Kennedy assassination. We'll come back to that in a minute. One of the people investigating the Maury Island affair and all of the UFO incidents that were taking place in the Pacific Northwest in 1947, in the months before and after the famous Roswell crash, was this man, FBI Special Agent in Charge, stationed in Butte, Montana. He was in charge of a bunch of files we call the SM-X files. According to the FBI's own documentation, UFO matters were classified as SM-X, Security Matter-X. These were the original X files. This man's name is Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister is a man who will come up again in our discussion 20 years later as a suspect in the Kennedy assassination. If you saw the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, this was Guy Bannister, the actor playing Guy Bannister. Now we come to another man called Jack Martin. Jack Martin's real name is Edward Suggs. He worked as an investigator for Guy Bannister, as a name that comes up in the files of the Office of Special Investigations of the military, as Agent Jack S. Martin, who was investigating UFO incidents in California in 1949. In the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, Jack Lemmon plays Jack Martin. I'm showing you these photographs from the film so you get a kind of context. If you've seen the film, you know that we're talking about real people, real individuals, and their real influence. These photographs have never been seen before in public. You're the first people in the entire world that is actually seeing these photographs, because they're photographs that were given to me personally by a man who was involved with Jack Martin, the Jack Lemmon character in JFK, the man involved, they say, in the Kennedy conspiracy in New Orleans, was also, in addition to being an investigator, in addition to being possibly a man investigating UFO incidents in California, in addition to being heavily involved in the group around Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in 1963, was also a bishop in a church, in a weird church, in a church that no one had ever heard of before, in a church that even Jim Garrison didn't understand. In his own documentation, in his own writings, going back to the House Select Subcommittee on Assassinations, when the United States government was going through an investigation of the assassinations in the 1970s, Jim Garrison wrote a note, copies of which I have, saying, look into this church stuff because I don't understand it. Well, there's Jack Martin, dressed as a priest in the 1970s after the Kennedy assassination. His friend and associate was David Ferry. David Ferry and Jack Martin both worked for Guy Bannister. David Ferry, former Eastern Airlines pilot, rabid anti-communist, very much involved in anti-communist activities. He's another bishop of the same church as Jack Martin. And of course, he knew Lee Harvey Oswald, as we know, in the Civil Air Patrol. In the movie, that was David Ferry, unforgettable guy in a fake wig and fake eyebrows, talking about enigmas wrapped in mysteries, wrapped in puzzles, wrapped in all kinds of things. So this is the David Ferry character that made famous in the film. And this is an actual photograph of David Ferry dressed again as a priest, as Jack Martin was. We have co-conspirators in the Kennedy assassination, as we will see, ties back to the UFO and the space program, who were involved in a strange church, a church that didn't really exist except on paper. And this is the church, the American Orthodox Catholic Church. If you review the FBI files, all of the investigations that were undertaken for the Warren Commission, and later by the House Subcommittee in the 1970s, this name will keep coming up, and no one does any background check on it, no one goes any further. Members of this church included a man called Profeta, we'll get to him in a second, David Ferry, Jack Martin, a man called Carl Stanley, who was mentioned in the FBI files, Tommy Jude Baumler, Thomas Beckham. These are all names familiar to researchers in the Kennedy assassination. They were all members of this church, most of whom were bishops in the church. The church had a lot of bishops, not many priests, and no congregations. Seriously. Just bishops, no priests, no congregations. Rarely did they have a building. This photograph was taken in the only building I ever knew that housed the American Orthodox Catholic Church in the Bronx, where I'm from. And I knew the church personally. I knew these individuals personally. I knew this guy right here. That's Profeta, the guy who created the church. I knew him. And I was a member briefly of this group because I lived practically next door. The other names on this list are extremely important. Ferry and Martin, we already know, involved in the Kennedy assassination conspiracy, at least according to Jim Garrison. Tommy Jude Baumler was a lawyer in New Orleans, and his claim to fame, as we found out only about a year ago, was that he was the man who incorporated another church, this one called the Process Church of the Final Resurrection, of the Final Judgment, rather, Process Church of the Final Judgment. This was the group that was implicated, rightly or wrongly, in the Charles Manson family, in possibly the Bobby Kennedy assassination. It goes on and on. There are all these churches that swim underneath the radar that have connections to intelligence agencies, the military, and as we will see, to the space program. This was Profeta. I knew this guy personally, a Ukrainian Orthodox priest who left the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to create this church of his own, the American Orthodox Catholic Church. He was picked by Thomas Dewey as the White House chaplain. There was an election between Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey. Everyone thought Dewey would win. Dewey was the Republican. Truman was the Democrat. Truman won by a narrow margin, and Profeta once showed me the letter that he got from Thomas Dewey appointing him as White House chaplain when Dewey thought he had won the election. This is how politically prominent and important he was. On the board of directors of the American Orthodox Catholic Church was J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the FBI, the man who gave us the X-Files and Guy Bannister and all the rest. J. Edgar Hoover was a member and on the board of directors of this phony church. Another member was Christopher Maria Stanley. He's now known as Saint Christopher Stanley. He was canonized by the guy who took over when he died. Close associate of all these guys. Ferry Martin tried to implicate him in the Kennedy assassination. He tried to implicate them in the Kennedy assassination. When Profeta had created the American Orthodox Catholic Church, he summoned all the other bishops who had been bishops with him in this church to go to New York and present their bona fides, their bona fides, their credentials to him and to Hoover. The only one who obeyed this was Carl Stanley, Christopher Maria Stanley. Christopher Stanley goes to New York, he goes to Profeta, he signs on, he goes back to his home in Kentucky, he's dead less than a month later, and only 2 weeks after the death of David Ferry, the mysterious death of David Ferry, another bishop in the same church. Suddenly the bishops of this church were all being killed. They were all dying under mysterious circumstances, all within a few weeks of each other. This story you have not heard before, because no one knows what to do with the material. No one knows what to do with this information. So when it comes to churches and guys in funny hats, you know, there is some degree of mystery out there and confusion. This is the organization as I, over the years, uncovered it, starting with our friend Profeta over there, to Christopher Stanley, to David Ferry, to Jack Martin. These were all guys implicated in the Kennedy assassination, and they all wore funny hats. The connection was this, another funny hat, that's J. Edgar Hoover in his Masonic Shriner fez, because he was a Freemason, as I think we all know. So there's J. Edgar Hoover, to Guy Bannister, the guy who investigated the UFOs in 1947, the guy who was writing up all these telexes and letters headlined SM-X file, UFO sighting here, UFO sighting there. Down here is Fred Krisman. He was the guy that Bannister was allegedly investigating. And next to Krisman, there's Profeta again. Profeta, who was on the same board of directors of a church as J. Edgar Hoover. All these people working in concert, all these people working together, a phony church, mysterious goings-on, and really weird hats. So what does all this have to do with the space program? You're sitting there thinking, okay, this is all very strange, but what are we here for? In the United States, the space race began on Halloween 1936. And you're looking at this charming group of individuals down there, relaxing in front of a rocket. These were America's first rocket scientists. And this is the launch at Arroyo Seco in California on October 31st, 1936. The very first launching of a rocket by American space engineers. Jack Parsons has a crater on the moon named after him. Jack Parsons was a co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, at Caltech in California. When you watch the space shuttle launches or you read anything about it, you'll always come across JPL all the time. He was a co-founder of JPL. Crater on the moon named after him. Solved a lot of issues regarding solid fuel storage of rocket material. And at the same time, he was a follower of Aleister Crowley. The Aleister Crowley, the infamous magician who created his own cult, his own religion. Parsons himself, at the same time he's working on rockets for the U.S. military, he's also conducting rituals in the desert trying to summon angels and demons. I'm not making this stuff up, in case you're wondering. One of his co-workers, one of his partners in his ritual working, his ritual magic, was L. Ron Hubbard, the man who later went on to found Scientology. Hubbard stole Jack Parsons' money, stole Jack Parsons' girlfriend, ran to Miami and bought a boat. In later years, Hubbard would speak very fondly of Aleister Crowley, claiming he had met him. He never did. Crowley died in 1947, before Hubbard had even actually heard of him. But Parsons was investigated by the FBI as a security risk because he was involved in occult workings. But at the same time, Parsons is a brilliant scientist. Well, just as he's getting ready to leave the United States through all the pressure of the FBI investigations, there's a mysterious explosion at his home. He dies under very mysterious circumstances. The house literally blows up with him in it. When we're talking today about the space race and the space programs, as we'll be getting into with the other speakers, keep in mind the fact that it began in two important places. It began in Germany with the rocket systems and the rocket development in Germany at Peenemünde, Nordhausen, which we'll get into in a second. But it also started in the United States. And the reason that China is launching rockets today and launching satellites is because of this man. Theodor von Karman was the leader of the group that founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He has a crater on the moon named after him. Born in Hungary, studied in Germany. He was a brilliant rocket scientist as well. And he formed the Jet Propulsion Laboratory with a couple of other people, Frank Molina and, of course, Parsons, Ed Foreman, and a Chinese scientist, another brilliant man called Qian Suisun. Qian Suisun goes on to later fame in another area of rocket science and space science. So von Karman was a guy shown here, by the way, with a Nazi scientist down here. This is Qian up here, and this is von Karman. This scientist, von Karman had known before in Germany and was instrumental in getting him to come to the United States to work on the space program with him. Qian was the man they sent to debrief Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun, of course, was the Nazi scientist that was brought to the United States under something called paperclip. Wernher von Braun we'll get into in more detail just in a few minutes. But Qian was also investigated by the FBI. Everybody involved in the rocket program in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s wound up being investigated by the FBI for one reason or another. He eventually got so sick and tired, he defected to China after all of the harassment he had been undergoing by the FBI. And what happened? He developed China's space program. He creates the Silkworm missile that was used to such effect during the first Iraq invasion. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and all of that, he was sending Scud missiles and all of this. The Silkworms were in use there in the Middle East. So Qian, starting as a patriotic American citizen helping with the space program, through all the suppression by FBI, all the harassment, gives up, basically, goes back to China, and becomes a hero in China. Develops, jump-starts the Chinese space program. A photograph of the team at Fort Bliss, Texas, paperclip members. That's a hell of a lot of Nazi scientists. And not a single funny hat among them, I will point out. One thing that's important to remember about the space program in the United States, until 1957, it was not a civilian program. For the first 10 years, or 15 years of its existence, it was a military program. There was no NASA. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration had not been created yet. So all of these people worked for the military. The rocket program was a military program. And you have to remember that's the origins of the space program, was with the Army. But at the same time, back in 1941, we have the first jet-assisted takeoff launch in California by the von Karman group. Jack Parsons is here. We have Jack Parsons right here watching the takeoff of the first jet-assisted takeoff plane, a jet-powered plane. So here we have the rocket scientist who's also an occultist and the follower of Aleister Crowley and a member of all kinds of other occult organizations involved in these important events of the rocket program. So the Nazi rocket program, as we know it, started at Peenemünde, was later relocated, and the person in charge of this was General Walter Dornberger, and his assistant was Wernher von Braun. Another important personality in aviation medicine this time was Dr. Hubertus Struckhold. He's a man in charge of all sorts of horrendous experiments on living persons in the camps, and yet is considered the father of aviation medicine. He was brought to the United States. He was given his own institute at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, and they had a building named after him until the local Daughters of the American Revolution decided that having a building named after this guy was probably not the best message to send to our next generations of young people studying medicine, so they took the name off. People were aware that Struckhold was basically a monster. Started as Operation Crossbow, Operation Overcast. The British were trying to get the scientists, Russians were trying to get Nazi scientists, and the Americans had their own program, which they then later renamed as Paperclip. It wasn't just the men The scientists they were bringing over, it was also their documentation. It was also as much machinery as they could possibly get. We are talking about hundreds of railroad cars, freight cars filled with documents and equipment and machinery. Not talking even about the hundreds at first, and then thousands of Nazi scientists that were brought to the United States. We were sold a bill of goods. I mean, the United States was told us, oh, these people are not really Nazis. They were Germans, they were scientists, they were helping out, they were working for us, they really weren't believers. Yeah, right. Why then, if this is so, did we bring the best and the brightest to the United States, give them whatever they wanted, all the resources that they wanted, whatever they needed, whatever they asked for? And the Soviet Union was the first country to launch a satellite into space. If they were really working for the United States and they had become born-again American patriots and card-carrying Republicans, yes, Republicans, how did it happen that we didn't get a rocket into space, we didn't get a satellite into space, that the Russians were the first? Well, what happened? Weren't they sabotaging our space program since the very beginning? These are the true believers. This is just a handful of the people you'll come across when you research this. Walter Dornberger later becomes the head of NASA. Later gets a board position with Bell Aerospace in the United States. Is considered a rabid Nazi by military intelligence officials who are doing background checks in Germany. They've got witness statements, they've got documents, they've got everything they need to put Dornberger in jail for the rest of his life. Those documents are buried. Werner von Braun was an SS major. There are photographs of Werner von Braun in an SS uniform. In order to join the SS, you had to prove your racial purity, going back to the year 1750. There had to be no Untermenschen in your background, right? No Jews, no Gypsies, no Slavs, no Democrats. Nobody like that in the background of your racial purity. You had to prove this, and you had to maintain a certain degree of involvement with the SS all the time. The SS was a pagan cult. The SS forbade mention of Christian holidays even in their documentation. The SS was extremely pagan, was extremely anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-everything else. If you had a rank of major in the SS, you did not get that automatically. You got that because you proved yourself. And Werner von Braun was proven later to have been involved in meetings discussing slave labor requirements for the rocket systems at Peenemünde and also at Mittelbau. He was involved in these discussions. He knew about the killings of prisoners, the torture of prisoners. He was involved in all of that. It didn't matter to Werner von Braun. At the same time that he's working for us, we bring him over under paperclip. He's now in the United States. What is he doing? He's sending classified materials out of the country to his comrades back in Germany. We know this. It's part of the documentation. It's part of the record now. These files have been declassified. Werner von Braun was working against the United States almost from the beginning. This is a scandal, But yet we consider him the father of the American space program. I mean, he's the one who got us to the moon, right? Kurt Debus was the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, the first director of the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral in Florida. He was a member of the SS and the SA, the Sturmabteilung, right, the brown shirts, the stormtroopers, two other Nazi organizations. This is the man who turned in his friends and co-workers to the Gestapo if they made disloyal remarks. This was a true believer, once again. As I say, he was an SS officer. The Allies considered the SS a criminal organization for very good reason. And yet, we put this guy in charge of the Kennedy Space Center. Theodor Zobel, another scientist, performed experiments on prisoners in the wind tunnel experiments. We brought him over. He worked for us. Hubertus Strughold, as I mentioned, tortured prisoners, killed people just for experiments, dumped them into freezing cold water to see how long they would survive. Stuff like that. Jumpstarts the Aviation Medicine Institute at Randolph Air Force Base. George Rickey, very famous Nazi, murdered prisoners personally murdered them at the Mittelbau-Dora site. Right, is given positions with American corporations in the United States. Emil Salmon worked as an engineer at Wright-Patterson, as you can see. He torched a synagogue. Heinz Gesicke, rocket engineer. His family in the United States during the war was spying for the Nazis. He was fine. He was okay. Denazified. You're wondering right now, is there a secret space program? Well, there was a secret space program in the 1940s for sure. Otto Ambros. We've all heard of Otto Ambros probably. Executive at IG Farben. This is the guy involved in administering the experiments in Zyklon B, the gas that was used in the death camps. He gets a job with W.R. Grayson Company. Leonard Alberts gets a job with the Bechtel Corporation. All big American corporations, all very important members of the military-industrial complex. His co-workers hated him, that he was just too Nazi even for them, and some of them were Nazis. Didn't hurt him at all. They moved him from position to position, but they kept him on. In May 29, 1947, to give you an idea of how badly the Nazi paperclip scientists were sabotaging the American space program. It's like, we have people going across the border this way, you're sending missiles this way, what's up? Well, the Germans in charge of this had sabotaged the guidance system so that it wouldn't go where it was supposed to go. And the American engineers who were responsible for some of these experiments were complaining like mad to the Pentagon, saying that these guys are nuts. They're doing all kinds of crazy stuff. They are not really on our side. These records have since been declassified. Not all of them. I mean, God forbid we should declassify records that are 60 years old from World War II, right? You're wondering right now, is there a secret space program? Well, there was a secret space program in the 1940s, for sure. There was a secret space program in the 1950s. The Nazi Party was a cult of true believers. Just because they lost the war doesn't mean they lost their true faith. So they maintained it through thick and thin. They looked down on their captors in the United States. To them it was a toss-up. Do we go to Russia? Do we go to the United States? There was no ideological choice being made. It was strictly a pragmatic one. Where are we going to get the best deal? So in 1947 we have the Cold War. First we bomb Mexico. And we apologize for that later. Then we have the Kenneth Arnold sighting. We have the Maury Island affair. We have famously Roswell. In 1947, that same year, the CIA is created. The Department of the Air Force is created. A year later, Truman defeats Dewey. I mention this because of the relationship to the other incidents that we're talking about. In 1950, the Korea War begins. Okay, so now we're in Cold War mode. Russians have poured across the border into North Korea. Okay. The brainwashing thing starts. Everybody's freaking out about the weird science that the Russians are using to brainwash American soldiers. Okay, a person very involved in this, in all the hysteria around this, in 1952, holds a seance in a farmhouse in Maine. The man is, no, not the Pope, not the funny hat guy, the other guy, Andrija Puharich. Andrija Puharich was a medical doctor, he was an inventor, he was a military man, a captain in the army, stationed at Camp Detrick, later Fort Detrick, Edgewood Arsenal later, he was stationed at. This is the area of the United States, the military that's involved with chemical and biological weapons. Puharich, however, was involved in trying to weaponize paranormal abilities. Puharich's focus in 1952, as early as 1952, is how can we use ESP, telepathy, all these things, in a military capacity. Since now we're facing a Cold War with people who use brainwashing methods, Puharich suddenly becomes a hot ticket item. He's talking about using the human brain and the powers of the brain to do all sorts of horrible things to people. He brings together 9 people in a seance. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense when you realize who these people are. One of them is Arthur Young. Some of you may have heard of Arthur Young. He wrote a lot of very well-received books, The Reflexive Universe, The Geometry of Meaning. Arthur Young was a great guy. He was the inventor of the Bell helicopter. He sold his rights and all of that. He left military engineering, military development at the end of World War II in order to pursue full-time his interest in the paranormal. He studied yoga, Eastern religions, ESP, psychokinesis, astrology, you name it, he was into it, Arthur Young. His wife, Ruth Forbes Payne Young, she was also at the seance. So we have Arthur Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter, the guy who created the Bell helicopter along with Larry Bell, his partner. We have his wife, the excessively nomenclatured Ruth Forbes Payne Young. That's all her husband. So she's married first to a Forbes. John Kerry, our presidential candidate, was a Forbes. It's a very old, very famous family. She was married to George Lyman Payne. Payne was a direct descendant of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and related, coincidentally, to an actor called Robert Treat Payne. Long story. But anyway, Ruth Forbes, also married to a Payne, also married to Arthur Young. Not at the same time, one after the other. She has a son, Michael Payne, who then gets a job at Bell Aerospace through Arthur Young's influence, because Arthur Young helped create the company. Her son needs a job. He gets him a job at Bell Aerospace in Texas. Her best friend is Mary Bancroft. Mary Bancroft was the longtime mistress of Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles, as you know, was a famous head of the CIA, the one that Jack Kennedy fired over the Bay of Pigs when he told Dulles he was going to split the CIA into a million pieces. Allen Dulles was the one who was fired by Kennedy and who later wound up on the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's death, very conveniently. So these are two people, two of the nine. So Michael Payne's boss, right? The boss of Michael Payne, Arthur Young's son-in-law, is none other than General Walter Dornberger. So Michael Payne has these direct connections right back to paperclip, back to the space program. Michael Payne's wife is also named Ruth. She's Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne is a Quaker. She likes folk dancing, walks on the beach, candlelit dinners, and the Russian language. Here is a woman called Marguerite Oswald. Here is Marina Oswald. The picture was taken on November 22nd, 1963, the day that Kennedy was assassinated. That evening, they're photographed in Ruth Payne's living room in Irving, Texas. It was Ruth Payne who got Lee Harvey Oswald the job at the Texas School Book Depository, right on the route where he would be able to assassinate the president. That's Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne had visited Arthur Young and her mother-in-law, Ruth Forbes Payne Young, in Philadelphia in September of 1963. She had Marina Oswald, this Russian defector, the wife of Lee Harvey Oswald, and her children living with her in her house. What was she talking about to Arthur Young, I wonder? Did she ever mention the fact that, hey, I got this Russian defector and his wife living with me in Irving, Texas, Lee Oswald? Maybe you heard of him. He was a Marine. He defected to the Soviet Union, wanting to become a Russian citizen. He redefected back to the United States. He did all of this, and the guy's still only 24 years old. That's pretty good for a 24-year-old. A Marine, somebody involved in the Atsugi Air Base in radar technicians, a guy who spoke Russian fluently enough that his Russian-born wife thought he was Russian. Russian is a damn hard language to learn. And yet this young kid, with hardly any formal education, just barely got out of high school, joins the Marines and learns to speak fluent Russian like that, so much that he can convince Marina that he's fluent, that he's a native Russian. So Marina Oswald, the niece at NKVD, an Army military intelligence officer, marries Lee Harvey Oswald, this Marine defector, very famous defector, and they decide to go back to the United States. Ruth Payne wants to learn Russian. That's her story. Oh, I'd love to learn Russian from Marina Oswald. So she gives her some room in her house because they're broke, and then Lee goes to Texas, and, well, the rest is history. So here's the nine. Here's the connection of these nine people. I didn't mention all the people of the nine. We'll get to that, but they're mostly DuPonts, Astors, Forbes, etc. These are the wealthiest families in the United States at the time, blue blood Americans with long pedigrees going back to the Mayflower or to the Declaration of Independence in some cases. Representatives of these families were at this bizarre seance. And during this seance in Maine, they were contacted, according to all the published documentation. I'm not making this stuff up and I'm not speculating. Puharich himself published this documentation, saying that aliens, a group of 9, contacted the group of 9 who were at this seance and said, we are 9, you are 9, we're giving you the mission, to help transform life on the planet. And what was their first major contribution was, having to do with the assassination of President Kennedy. So this 9 to me is very strange. We have to ask ourselves a lot of questions. Did that somehow promote, evolution on this planet, or did that do just the opposite? So there's Arthur Young. There's his daughter-in-law, Ruth Payne. Lee Harvey Oswald to Kennedy. The connections are very tight. And another member of the Nine, of course, was an Astor, as I mentioned, Ava Alice Muriel Astor. So all American aristocracy. What does all this have to do with what we're talking about? Okay, in New Orleans, before the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald gets a job with the William Riley Coffee Company. The coffee company still exists. He went down there to get a job. He worked for a short time. He quits. He tells a coworker, hey, I've just found the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, according to the quotation. He's getting a job at NASA. Well, in 1957, the Russians sent up a Sputnik, and that scared the hell out of the American military establishment. It scared the hell out of the American people. They said, we have all these Nazi scientists, what are we getting for our, what bang for the buck are we getting here? So we have to do something about this. And so they put the fear of God into the Nazi scientists and said, okay, listen guys, enough is enough, we fooled around enough, now we have to actually do something. And so the government took control of the space program away from the military and gave it to a civilian organization, NASA. The problem with that was they moved the Nazi scientists from the military to NASA. So it was a change in name only. Suddenly you have military scientists who were Nazis, who were true believers. Now they're working for a civilian agency for NASA under the US government. We didn't really change anything. Direct military control was lost, but the Nazis were still in command. After the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald leaves the William Riley Coffee Company. He never does work for NASA, although we find out that he was probably working out of an office at the NASA site that was an employment agency for the CIA. This is something that's also come up recently. Anyway, he leaves William Riley. He leaves New Orleans, goes to Texas. After the assassination, his co-workers also all get jobs at NASA. At NASA. They're coffee company clerks, and they got jobs at NASA. As I mentioned, Ruth Paine had visited his wife, visits Arthur Young and his wife. Arthur Young believes, or he's been told, that he's been in contact with these 9 supernatural beings. Andrija Puharich, the guy who organizes this, the captain in the army involved in weaponizing the paranormal, he's the guy who discovers Uri Geller, the Israeli psychic who bends spoons by looking at them. He brings Uri Geller to the United States. He gets him involved with the Sanford Research Institute, run by Scientologists, as it turns out. All this other stuff is going on. Uri Geller eventually says he got tired of it. He thought that he was being run by Puharich as an intelligence asset. He really felt that Puharich was an intelligence agent running him as an agent for one of the intelligence agencies. But part of that program was that he felt from time to time he was being put in contact with extraterrestrial beings. Geller was mystified by what was going on in his brain by all of this. Now, whether you think about Uri Geller as being genuine or not, or a player or not, or whatever, Geller is pretty open and honest about his relationship with Puharich. He didn't like him, he distrusted him, and eventually he cut off relations with him. So then in New Orleans, after the assassination, Garrison remembers David Ferrie, Jack Martin, all these guys, Guy Bannister. He conducts his own investigation. And he finds that all of these guys were bishops in a church, except for Guy Bannister, who was like the Pope or something, of the Vatican in New Orleans. And then Guy Bannister and Fred Krisman were the guys who jump-started the UFO thing in 1947 after Kenneth Arnold. So he calls in Fred Krisman. Guy Bannister is dead. He died in 1964, again mysteriously. So what was the secret space program? In 1947, we had the famous Roswell incident. The Roswell debris, we know, is taken to Wright Air Force Base, eventually Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Wright Field at the time, which is the same place where we bring Walter Dornberger, Werner von Braun, and everybody else preliminarily. We bring them all together. All these guys are together in 1947 in one place. At the same time, we have all these UFO sightings. We have Nazi scientists in the space program. We're afraid the Russians have the bomb. As it turns out, a lot of people had the bomb in those days. We have a group of wealthy Americans, all involved in the militarization of the paranormal. And they make this contact with this extraterrestrial group called the Nine. I wrote a book called Sinister Forces. The very first volume is called The Nine. And it focuses on this strange bit of connections. We have this family, this group of families having a seance in 1952 in Maine, talking to aliens in a spaceship hovering over the Earth, they say. And then later we find tendrils leading out from that seance directly to the Kennedy assassination, among other things. But the Kennedy assassination being the most important and the most obvious one. If you follow the Kennedy assassination, you may know of a guy called George de Mohrenschildt. He was a Russian CIA contract agent who eventually helped in some way Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina. He was involved with them. He commits suicide before he has to give an interview about all of this. I mean, Lee Harvey Oswald was surrounded by so many bishops and so many members of the Nine, the poor guy had no chance, you know. I mean, he was basically surrounded by people who all felt they had some sort of mysterious mission, and Lee Harvey Oswald was the guy in the middle. Oswald himself didn't have much of a connection this way. Connection to military intelligence, probably. That fluency in Russian should tip you off right away in those days. But the rest of the connections to the Nine, to the assassinations before and since, are incredible. They're astonishing. We know the CIA was blamed for the Kennedy assassination. We've all heard the stories. But what we don't really realize is the CIA, at the time of the assassination, for instance, was heavily involved with another Nazi organization, the Gehlen organization, which was running agents for the CIA in Eastern Europe and against the Soviet Union. Again, just like in Paperclip, these Nazi scientists were not really working for us. They were taking our money, they were giving us phony reports, they were virtually useless against us. Allen Dulles was protecting Nazi war criminals since before the war ended. We know that in transcripts of speeches and talks that he had with famous Nazi leaders going back to 1944 and 1945. And the fascinating thing about Allen Dulles, bringing all of these pieces of these disparate things together, was that he was Mary Bancroft's mistress. Okay, Mary Bancroft was the friend of Ruth Forbes Payne Young. During the Warren Commission interviews with witnesses, and you can read this in the Warren Commission transcripts, look for Ruth Payne. Read her, she appeared twice before the commission, talking about what she was doing in the days and weeks and months leading up to the assassination, how she knew Lee and Marina Oswald, all of these questions. Allen Dulles is part of that committee. He's sitting in. At the point where Ruth Payne starts to talk about her trip to Philadelphia to meet Arthur Young 2 months before the assassination, 3 months before the assassination, Allen Dulles cuts her off and changes the subject. He does not allow her to finish the story. Read the transcript for yourself, you'll see it. It's blatant. Allen Dulles, who's been quiet the entire time, suddenly jumps in, like a defense attorney, and then suddenly says, oh no, we're not, let's talk about this instead. As she's about to say who she met, who she was dealing with, Allen Dulles changes the subject, changes the story. Her information about Arthur Young never makes it into the record, and she hasn't talked about it since. So what do we have? We have a Garrison investigation alleging there was a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination. The problem with Garrison trying to prove all of this is that he had a cast of characters nobody would believe, right? He had Clay Shaw, who was an unbelievable character on his own, the man that he was trying for the assassination. But he also had all these other characters. He had all these bishops, He didn't know what to do with these bishops. He couldn't understand that the bishops were a front for an intelligence operation. He suspected it, but he didn't know where to go with it. Paranormal researchers, UFO personalities like Guy Bannister, like Fred Krisman, and of course employees of NASA. All of these people can be tied back to Paperclip, can be tied back to the Nazi space program, the people that we brought over. The history of the last 100 years is largely still classified. We live in a kind of dream world, thinking that we know what actually happened, right? Then we have to go back and say, wait a minute, what really happened? If we talk about Paperclip, the way I was taught in school in the 1950s and 60s was that the Nazis these were good Germans. Werner von Braun was never a Nazi. Dornberger was never a Nazi. All these guys were on our side. As it turns out, it wasn't true. As it turns out, they were sabotaging us every step of the way. Our space program was the result of Nazis trying to stonewall us and to prevent us from getting there, until eventually, after Sputnik, they were told, you better do it or get out. So that's what happened. We sold our soul in the United States, and not just the United States, believe me, other countries as well, including the Soviet Union. We sold our soul for this technology. We dealt with some of the worst war criminals in history. Not just even the Holocaust, but the idea that they had slave labor that they worked to death and replaced with other slave laborers. And these people who employed these slave laborers deliberately, who were involved in every step of that process, including the killing of these laborers also, were the people that we brought over for the space program. Our space program has its origins in people, on the one hand, like Jack Parsons, who once wrote that he was the Antichrist. He was a brilliant man, but he believed he was the Antichrist and was ushering in a new age of witchcraft, according to him. And he was a follower of Crowley and member of the Ordo Templi Orientis and all of this, a very brilliant guy, but a very strange guy, on the one hand, and we had the Nazis on the other. You know, these were the people that were jump-starting the space program of the United States.